The news spread silently, like a shadow that suddenly covers every corner of the web. First, it was the case of Yu Menglong, whose disturbing circumstances awakened a wave of suspicion. Later, almost like an echo returning from some unknown place, comments, images, and posts related to him began to disappear. That succession of sudden deletions generated a shuddering contrast between the visible and the hidden, a contradiction that sowed unease in the public and revived old fears about similar tragedies that had shaken the entertainment world. It was as if an invisible thread connected various episodes that had never been fully explained. In the midst of that climate of uncertainty emerged a name that, for many, evoked light, vitality, and a meteoric rise to fame. It was Qiao Renliang, the close friend of the renowned actress Chen Qiao, a young man whose trajectory seemed destined solely for glory. His story had begun far from the noise of the stages, on the athletic training fields where his discipline allowed him to reach second place nationally in the high jump. Later, driven by a warm voice and a captivating stage presence, he made his way into the entertainment industry and conquered the affection of an entire generation. His image, however, acquired a different nuance when, at the brightest point of his career, an unexpected tragedy occurred that ended his life at 28 years old. The news was received with a mixture of disbelief and grief. Many wondered how it was possible that someone whose energy and talent seemed inexhaustible had disappeared so abruptly. Possible explanations began to multiply while the authorities disseminated their initial reports, and the public analyzed every detail with growing distrust. That collective bewilderment revived a question that had never been definitively answered. Was this disappearance a personal drama marked by emotional fragility, or did a more complex background exist that no one dared to reveal? Some coincidences with other recent cases fueled suspicions. The feeling that something remained hidden, perhaps deliberately silenced, took over forums and digital profiles. It was a persistent whisper that expanded without anyone being able to stop it. In that scenario charged with latent tensions, his figure returned to occupy the center of the conversation. The public not only evoked the brilliant artist who had illuminated the screen, but also the young man who, according to later testimonies, had fought for years against an emotional pressure impossible to measure from the outside. Even so, even those who accepted the official version did not cease to find dissonant elements that defied any simple reading of the case. The complexity of his trajectory seemed to reflect the very functioning of the show business world, a space where light coexists with shadow and where success can hide silences that are difficult to decipher. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damages, to see how the entertainment world functions and how an icon is redefined. The formation of Qiao Renliang's story cannot be understood without returning to his childhood, a period marked by physical distance from his father, a ship captain who spent long months away from home. That constant absence created an emotional space that, far from fracturing him, molded in him a precocious maturity and a discipline uncommon among young people of his age. He grew up accompanied by the permanent affection of his mother, who took charge of building a stable environment in the midst of an irregular family routine. That balance between tenderness and responsibility became the basis of his reserved, observant, and silently determined character. The decisive turn arrived thanks to a fortuitous encounter with coach Li Zuwen, a woman known for her firmness and for the ability to detect potential where others only saw youth. She perceived in that agile-bodied adolescent a singular energy, a mixture of concentration and perseverance that little by little transformed into visible talent. Under her strict guidance, Qiao began to discover a world that demanded sacrifice, constancy, and an absolute willingness to endure physical pain. It was a path where every fall onto the mat became a lesson, and every failed jump fueled a deeper desire for self-improvement. During his high school years, his life was divided between academic obligations and prolonged training. He remained on the track even when the daylight was extinguished, executing the same movements over and over again with untiring will. Those silent days, marked by the smell of rubber and the friction of cold air, taught the young athlete that reaching a goal is not a matter of inspiration, but of endurance. That stage forged the emotional foundation that would later sustain his career in the entertainment industry, a realm much more complex than sports and where demands are not always visible. Recognition arrived early. In the year 2003, at just 16 years old, he surprised the country by conquering the National High Jump Championship. The press described that moment with almost poetic metaphors, noting that he seemed to glide through the sky with a lightness that defied all odds. His name began to circulate among athletics specialists, and some coaches considered him the promise that could equal the legacy of great figures of the discipline. However, the road to sporting excellence offers no guarantees. Despite his talent, his progress stabilized shortly after, and he failed to surpass the category of a second-level national athlete. That reality, although painful, confronted him with a transcendental decision. Instead of interpreting that limitation as a defeat, he chose to view it as a transit toward another destiny. From the first years of competition, it had become evident that he possessed something more than physical ability. His natural presence, confident bearing, and a warm-toned voice differentiated him from many young people in his environment. That set of attributes awakened the attention of those who knew him and opened a new question in his mind. Did a place exist where he could express his artistic sensibility with the same dedication he demonstrated on the track? That intuition led him to sit for the entrance exam of the Shanghai Academy of Electrical Sciences, an institution where he found a creative community willing to challenge conventions. There, he emerged not only as a disciplined student, but as the heart of a musical band that enlivened student events. He played the guitar with dexterity and sang with an emotional intensity that captivated even those who did not know him. Under his leadership, the group obtained first place in a contest that gathered the best university bands in the city. It was the first clear sign that his life was changing course, and that his voice was beginning to find an audience that listened to him with attention. That moment of personal discovery coincided with an inner awakening. On stage, Qiao was no longer the young athlete of inflexible discipline, but a performer capable of transmitting sensitivity, strength, and mystery in equal parts. Every word he intoned seemed to connect with intimate episodes of his life. Every melody gave shape to feelings that until then had remained nameless. The stage became a space where he could release repressed emotions, express the loneliness that had accompanied his childhood, and mold an identity that did not depend exclusively on physical performance. That transformation was so profound that those who saw him perform in that era remembered the sensation of witnessing the birth of an authentic vocation. In the year 2005, he made the decision to present himself at the musical contest organized by a television network in Hunan province. It was a risky decision, but essential. The competition gathered thousands of aspirants with talent, and each presentation demanded a level of dedication that went beyond vocal technique. However, his serenity distinguished him. He went up on stage with the confidence of someone who has overcome greater challenges and intoned his songs with a sincerity that impressed both the audience and the jury. His triumph in the contest placed him immediately on the national map. But more than a trophy, that achievement represented the confirmation that life was offering him a new path, one in which his voice would serve as an instrument to express what his silences had not allowed to be revealed. From that instant, his universe changed rapidly. Popularity enveloped him with intensity and led him toward a world where public recognition coexists with pressures difficult to decipher. While others celebrated his rise, he began to perceive the weight of an invisible responsibility. Expectations grew. Outside gazes analyzed every movement. The industry opened its doors, but also imposed rhythms that demanded an emotional strength that many young artists fail to consolidate in time. That contrast between the joy of success and internal tension marked a crucial point in the evolution of his story. What is your opinion on this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The night of May 16th of the year 2016 took an unexpected turn for the entertainment industry when, at 6:21 in the evening, Shanghai authorities received an urgent call. The voice of Qiao Renliang's girlfriend transmitted a panic difficult to hide. Minutes later, the police arrived at the scene and confirmed that the young artist had been found lifeless. The news spread with surprising speed. The digital atmosphere transformed in a matter of hours, creating an informational whirlwind that gave no time for silence or reflection. What should have been the start of a cautious investigation became a viral phenomenon that agitated millions of users during that night. The preliminary details, divulged by local media shortly after, added drama to the event. The artist's body presented indications that awakened intense doubts among the public. The official description pointed out that the cause of death was asphyxia and that the passing had occurred several hours before the arrival of the police. This information, offered with a tone of apparent decisiveness, failed to appease the concern. On the contrary, it opened a space of suspicion that expanded rapidly. People began to share and analyze every image, every phrase, and every report, believing that between the lines they would find answers that still did not appear. The reaction on digital platforms reached extraordinary figures. In less than 24 hours, the artist's name positioned itself in the first place of searches on Weibo, accumulating hundreds of millions of views. This phenomenon revealed two simultaneous forces: the magnitude of the affection he had awakened during his career and the unease that was beginning to envelop everything. While many expressed sincere sadness, others initiated discussions that acquired an increasingly critical tone. The official information from the police, which attributed the death to an episode of severe depression, failed to convince a significant part of the public, especially because some elements of the case presented themselves in a confusing manner. The first point of controversy arose with the exact time of death. Although the statement spoke of a death occurring a few hours earlier, versions circulated claiming that the body had been found in a state suggesting an earlier date. These doubts were not publicly clarified by the authorities. That lack of precision fueled the sensation of uncertainty. The web began to fill with speculations that interpreted the absence of details as a sign of opacity. The second focus of unease originated from leaked photographs that showed an uncommon perspective of the artist's body. In some images, the absence of the left arm was apparently appreciated. The photographs were deleted from platforms in a very short time, but the initial impression persisted. Users wondered how it was possible that such images had circulated and why they disappeared so fast. Interpretations grew until acquiring a disturbing tone, and although explanations were later offered attributing the visual impression to the position of the body, the damage was already done. Doubt had installed itself. The third controversy related to the place where the body was found. Many followers believed that the artist lived alone in his apartment, so they expected the tragedy to have occurred there. However, it was revealed that the location was a friend's residence. Although this fact could have a simple explanation, it created a contrast that bewildered those attempting to mentally reconstruct the artist's last movements. The proximity to other recent cases, where death in others' homes had also been mentioned, intensified the impression that a common pattern existed. The fourth controversial element occurred when some witnesses claimed that the ambulance used did not belong to the official medical service. These declarations were never verified, but in the digital environment, they found fertile ground. People began to question why, in a city of the magnitude of Shanghai, such a delicate emergency would have required a vehicle of dubious origin. The suggestion of possible irregularities increased collective tension. The fifth point that stoked doubts was related to the supposed visible signs on the artist's body in the weeks prior to his death. Some spectators claimed to have noticed slight injuries on his neck and arms during public appearances. The official explanation indicated that they could have been produced during recordings or as an effect of the emotional instability he was facing. However, people from his professional environment stated that he rarely showed signs of anguish before the camera. The coexistence of these incompatible versions maintained the atmosphere of uncertainty. The sixth element that further complicated the narrative was the finding of a plane ticket purchased for a trip scheduled for the next day. For many, this detail seemed incompatible with the idea that the artist was contemplating ending his life. The comparison with other similar cases reinforced that perception. Although this datum, on its own, does not constitute conclusive proof, it did contribute to the public interpreting the case from a more critical perspective. The seventh point of conflict was the supposed use of a bag to provoke asphyxia. Specialists and users pointed out that this technique contradicts natural survival reflexes. The idea that a person in full use of their faculties could perform such an act without resistance awakened incredulity. Although authorities insisted on the validity of the conclusion, the explanation failed to obtain consensus. The eighth and final point centered on the absence of complete documentation regarding his treatment for depression. The fact that these records were not made public generated speculations. Some wondered if reports existed that had not been revealed. Others debated the restricted access to this type of information for legal reasons. In any case, the lack of clarity kept suspicions alive. While all this was happening, friends, colleagues, and relatives of the artist found themselves enveloped in a storm of opinions. Social pressure not only examines the facts, but also seeks culprits even in places where there are none. This emotional climate contributed to the case acquiring dimensions that exceeded personal tragedy. The artist's death became the epicenter of a collective debate on transparency, responsibility, and media culture. As doubts accumulated and the public tried to understand what had happened, an element emerged that completely altered the conversation. It was a rumor, first disseminated in small entertainment circles, that attributed the tragedy to a supposed link with one of the most influential figures among young businessmen in China. That rumor arose at a moment when the search for explanations was reaching its most intense point. The appearance of a powerful name increased the drama and generated immediate attention. The case began to take the form of an enigma that overflowed the borders of the artistic sphere and penetrated into broader imaginaries about power, influence, and silence. Everything intensified when a photograph began to circulate in which Qiao Renliang appeared, accompanied by a group of people, among them the mentioned businessman. On the table rested a cake adorned with drawings and a message directed at the artist. Although no proof existed that the image corresponded to the night before his death, many users interpreted it that way. The photograph became an emotional trigger. The scene, apparently innocent, adopted different meanings according to the observer. Some saw in it a simple celebration. Others imagined a disturbing background. The absence of verifiable information allowed the collective imagination to advance without a break. Social media became fertile ground for contradictory versions, where anonymous voices claimed to have knowledge of the artist's private habits. According to these versions, Qiao would have investigated certain uncommon behaviors to prepare for a film role. These affirmations, impossible to verify, were interpreted by some as additional indications of a private life more complex than what was known publicly. However, people who had worked with him insisted that his habitual behavior was reserved and respectful, which contrasted with the suppositions that were circulating. This disparity underscored the difficulty of interpreting fragmented accounts that arise in moments of confusion. The impact of the photograph and the rumors extended to the lives of those who made up his closest circle. Actress Chen Xiaoen, an intimate friend of the artist, saw herself subjected to constant questioning for her initial silence. Any action or absence of hers was analyzed with intensity. The pressure also reached the artist's family, who had to face comments that fluctuated between compassion and severe criticism. This phenomenon revealed how, in times of uncertainty, public scrutiny becomes overflowing and hinders the grieving process. The tragedy ceased to be a private matter and transformed into a space of collective debate where every detail was discussed over and over again. In the midst of this tension, unexpected connections began to appear. Some users recalled previous cases of deceased young artists, which gave rise to disturbing comparisons. Yu Menglong was mentioned, whose death had generated similar suspicions. There was also talk of a singer whose passing occurred a few days after a live broadcast. The case of an actress who died falling from a building in inexplicable circumstances added another perturbing element. The fact that each of these artists had a relationship with the same representation company led some observers to formulate hypotheses about a shared pattern. The coincidences seemed too numerous for a part of the public. The youth of the artists, the ascending moment of their careers, and the presence of unresolved questions stimulated the idea that something deeper united these cases. Others pointed out that the entertainment industry possesses complex dynamics that generate pressures difficult to bear. According to this view, the tragedies could be the result of accumulated factors such as stress, emotional exhaustion, excessive expectations, and relentless work structures. Even so, the narrative of coincidences remained installed and conditioned the way in which many interpreted the death of Qiao Renliang. The police, upon concluding their investigation, categorically denied any link between these tragedies. Their conclusion pointed out that no evidence existed connecting the cases, and that the speculations lacked foundation. However, in the digital universe, the absence of absolute certainties did not eliminate the doubts. The speed with which posts appeared and disappeared, the lack of transparency on some points, and the emotional complexity of the case generated a climate in which the official explanation did not suffice for everyone. People sought answers that could balance the sadness with the need to understand such an unexpected event. In this environment, accounts about the artist's health began to emerge with greater clarity. His closest friends mentioned that he had suffered from severe insomnia for some time. They explained that there were days when he could barely rest, and that emotional exhaustion accumulated in silence. His family confirmed these versions and added that he avoided sharing his worries so as not to worry them. These statements provided a more intimate perspective that contrasted with the image he projected in public, always smiling and in control. The portrait that emerged was that of a young man facing his own internal challenges while trying to comply with the external demands of his profession. Collective memory began to divide between two opposing interpretations. On one hand was the view that accepted the official version as a reflection of a prolonged struggle against emotional deterioration. On the other, the suspicion persisted that the elements mentioned previously pointed toward something more. This duality defined the way in which the case was remembered and discussed in the following years. The tragedy of Qiao Renliang became a metaphor for the tensions that young artists go through between intimacy, pressure, and constant scrutiny. Despite attempts to clarify the facts, the case remained wrapped in an aura of mystery. The answers failed to close all the questions. The coincidences with other tragedies, the intensity of the rumors, and the emotional complexity of the context created a narrative that remained open. That space of uncertainty consolidated itself as an inseparable component of the artist's history. What really happened continues to be a subject of debate. Reality seems to be situated at an intermediate point between the evident and the intangible, a territory where versions coexist that will hardly be reconciled. And in that intermediate territory, where doubt persists and memory fragments, the true impact of his absence begins to be delineated, an impact that inevitably leads toward the questions that will define the outcome of this story. The story of Qiao Renliang left a deep mark on the collective imagination, not only for the brilliance he radiated during his life, but also for the complexity that surrounded his departure. His trajectory, marked by effort, discipline, and sensitivity, revealed the human dimension that often remains hidden behind the public image. The intensity with which he lived his personal challenges reflected the fragility that can exist even in those who seem invincible from a distance. His absence opened a space for reflection that continues to be valid, a space where society examines its own expectations toward the figures it admires. With the passage of time, official investigations consolidated as a reference for understanding the facts. However, public perceptions remained divided. The lack of absolute certainties, added to the speed with which information circulates in the digital age, contributed to the narrative surrounding his death never being completely closed. The case transformed into a mirror, reflecting the emotional complexity of young artists and the pressures they face in a competitive environment. In that sense, Qiao's story also became a reminder of the importance of attending to emotional health in a world where appearances tend to dominate the conversation. Through his artistic legacy, Qiao Renliang continues to be present in the memory of those who admired him. His voice, his stage presence, and his ability to connect with the public form part of a cultural heritage that transcends the circumstances surrounding his private life. His influence endures in those who saw in him an example of dedication and sensitivity. That symbolic continuity constitutes a form of permanence that no controversy can erase. His work invites reflection on the way in which creativity arises from both strength and vulnerability. The repercussions of his case opened a broader debate on the functioning of the entertainment industry. Subsequent discussions raised questions about the responsibility of companies, the emotional exhaustion of artists, the management of fame, and the speed with which collective debates are generated. In such a context, Qiao's case motivated many to consider the need for more solid support mechanisms, as well as a social dialogue that recognizes the human complexity that exists behind every public figure. The conversation continues and is likely to keep evolving as new generations of artists emerge. The future of Qiao's memory will depend largely on how the public chooses to interpret his trajectory. Some will remember him for his exceptional talent, others for the questions his story left open. In any case, his legacy pushes for reflection on the balance between success and well-being, a balance that contemporary society still seeks to understand. The memory of his life and his work becomes an invitation to look beyond the surface and recognize the humanity that inhabits every story. Now, an open question remains for those following this narration. What aspects of this story would you like us to explore in greater depth? Or what topic related to the entertainment world do you wish for us to address in the next analysis? You can leave your comment to continue the conversation.